Hello, podcast listeners. You are now listening to the Coffee, Health, and Science Podcast. I'm your host, Jordan River, and I want to thank you for tuning in again today. Before we get started, I urge you to share the show. Spread the Coffee, Health, and Science Podcast. Share the show with a coffee lover, or maybe somebody who would be interested in the health effects of coffee. I do appreciate it. Make sure you're subscribed so you catch every episode. Give us a good rating and review. It helps us out a lot more than you might think. Thank you, guys. Today's episode, it is a unique one. It is certainly a coffee history episode, but a little bit different. We've never gone down this path. We've explored all sorts of facets of the coffee beverage and the cultivation of the coffee cherry. But today, we focus on the wonderful technology that brings us that coffee brew. Really, today's episode is all about the history of the coffee pot, but also transitions into the history of coffee makers. I know, strange, a bit different, but very fascinating. I'm really excited for today's exploration, so let's jump right in. Now, if we go all the way back, around 1,000 years ago, back to the time of the legend of Kaldi, the goat herder. You remember Kaldi from our ancient coffee history episode. He was the Ethiopian goat herder who supposedly stumbled upon the stimulating effects of coffee, and he ended up giving some coffee cherries to a monk who supposedly became the first person to brew the seeds, the coffee beans, into a drink. So the legend goes. Well, if that legend is true, the monk that brewed that coffee, before coffee brewing was a thing, probably used an ancient method that is very, very simple. You see, the earliest form of coffee was brewed using what's called a brewing pan, a large pan of hot water, and they would roast that over an open flame, and they would even filter this coffee through a cloth to separate the brew. So that's really interesting to think that literally the oldest version of coffee is filtered coffee. They had to filter out the grounds, and they were pouring through a cloth filter. If you remember back to the heart health episode with Dr. Coffee, he talked about how filtered versus unfiltered brewing, the filter pulls out the lipids, which increases the heart health of the coffee. If that type of cholesterol is something that's on your radar, then that's not something you want to be adding into your diet. So the oldest version of coffee is the healthy version of coffee. It was filtered. And unfiltered coffee really didn't come until later, even though filters themselves evolved. Really interesting note, and not surprising that there are such old cited sources of the medicinal benefits of coffee, because I think that probably helped too, that they were filtering it from the start. Now back to the coffee timeline, you'll remember that for the next several hundred years, coffee was very protected. It was only available in select Middle Eastern trade regions for export, and there were virtually no other nations or societies or cultures growing the beans themselves. But in the middle of the 1000s AD, you have coffee finally escaping Arabia, if you will, and making its way all over the world, to the Netherlands, to Java via the Dutch. You have the legend of Gabriel de Clue stealing the plant. And eventually, at this point, the coffee bean was prolific, and its preparation methods began to evolve and change as well. In the 1700s, for instance, the brewing process of coffee evolved to an even more modern and recognizable method. The coffee was wrapped in a linen cloth instead of filtered after the fact. Instead, it was wrapped and tied like a sachet, and this was then placed in the pan of boiling water to help get a stronger brew. They were already combining methods of steeping, already changing the way that coffee was being brewed 300 years ago. And as popularity and demand grew, and by the way, it never stopped growing, eventually coffee drinkers gave the boot to the boiling pan. It just was not very effective or easy or efficient. And thus, the home coffee pot was born, already popular in the 1600s among nobility. These were specialized containers that were specifically designed for brewing coffee. They would have attached lids to help the coffee infuse. The bottoms were wider than the tops to help capture the sunken coffee grounds that may have escaped. And eventually, spouts were added on each side of the lip. As simple as it may seem, the coffee pot was an incredible leap forward in coffee's journey to ubiquity. Some of these now antique coffee pots are absolutely brilliant and beautiful, ranging from angular, metal, utilitarian-looking devices, all the way up to magnificently ornate coffee pots, made with silver and ordained with beautiful etchings all over it. I encourage you to take a look at some of the search image results online, if you have a moment, to see all the different kinds and all the spectacular designs of these antique coffee pots. The earliest versions will often have just a plain cylinder shape or maybe a pear shape to them. But then, of course, they changed over time, as we said, with things like a lower spout placement or an octagonal shape. Here's an interesting fact for you. The spouts on pots weren't placed on the opposite side of the handle until the 1720s. You think they would have figured that out a bit quicker? As fast as this coffee technology seems to move, they were putting the spouts on opposite sides, perpendicular to the handle, and then eventually someone found out you should put it opposite to the handle around 1720. Because the massive demand for coffee was on the rise, and like I said, would not stop for hundreds of years, coffee pots began being mass-produced. Silversmiths, professional metal workers in England and America, would dedicate their careers to crafting and perfecting these coffee pots. They even made coffee urns for those who needed a larger supply on hand. That's what they were called, these larger chambers for producing a ton of coffee. Maybe if you needed to serve folks, for instance. A coffee urn. I had not heard that one before. In the late 18th century, some beautiful, beautiful coffee pots were crafted by famous craftsmen. For instance, Paul de Lemere. They featured classic ornamentation with asymmetrical designs and motifs, including seashells. These things are beautiful. This particular renowned silversmith is still well recognized today posthumously for his incredible craftsmanship in producing fine and collectible silver coffee pots. One coffee pot created by Lemere just sold at auction in 2013 for about 4.5 million pounds. By the 1780s, filters were added to coffee pots in the form of a cloth or sock placed over the mouth. This is interesting because in our Coffee Around the World episode, this is something that they do in Malaysia. This is something they do elsewhere. I wonder if some influence came over. Again, the late 1700s, we now have the coffee grounds placed in the sock at the end of the mouth of the pot. And then hot water was then poured through them. The Mr. Biggin coffee pots was the first company to introduce a coffee pot with a place for the filter. And these pots received instant popularity and blew up in the late 1700s. Mr. Biggin coffee pots. That is a wonderful piece of coffee history right there. The only problem with all these types of coffee brewing methods, though, was the inevitability that the cloth filter itself, whatever they may have been using, the burlap or who knows, that would transfer some of its flavor into the coffee drink. And obviously that's a problem, tainting the taste, and it's a problem that wouldn't be solved until way later in our timeline, further down the road, 1908 to be exact, when the paper coffee filter was invented. But we'll get to that in a minute. Let's now enter, we're just heading into the early 1800s. Espresso machines and coffee percolators were introduced in 1818. And by the end of the century, the plunger filter had been invented. But these technologies were unperfected and clunky and would soon be replaced by the Napier vacuum coffee machine. That's right, vacuum coffee makers came into the game in 1840. This was a massively popular method of brewing in the 1800s. The vacuum coffee machines are also known as siphon machines. There are many, many different kinds of them. the balloon siphon machines. These are the kinds that Dr. Coffee has talked about before on this show. You have to look up pictures of vacuum coffee machines and siphon coffee machines from the 1800s. They are incredible looking. They look like a chemistry set or something out of Leonardo da Vinci's. It looks like something Leonardo da Vinci would have used to brew up his favorite beverage. Now, fast forward to 1865, the first patent for a coffee percolator was filed by American James Nason. We take another massive step towards what we would recognize as modern coffee brewing, and percolators took over. This was the method of brewing, basically up until what we do now. We're going to get to that in a minute. A quick side note, a history of the espresso machine. Now, as we said, the early machines were invented in the early 1800s, 1818 about. And espresso is simply just pressed coffee, pressurized coffee. And I'm sure that there were people preparing coffee this way before the 1800s. But as we said, 1818, the espresso maker is invented. But then in 1884, the espresso machine was perfected and patented by Angelo Moriando. Yes, the espresso machine is that old. Unfortunately, he wasn't able to popularize the machine. It didn't really match our current espresso machines or anything close to it. But around 1901, the machine's design were improved even further by a Milanese mechanic named Luigi Bezzera. And he patented a number of his improvements, and that's when we get the espresso machine that we're so familiar with. Some additions still coming in the later 1900s. But the turn of the century there is when espresso really came to be. So much longer after the traditional brews. Espresso is so young, even though the machines date back a little bit further culturally. It's very, very young. To wrap up this espresso side note, in 1906, Bezzera's patents, aforementioned, were bought by Pavoni, who founded the world-famous La Pavoni brand and started producing espresso machines commercially, and those debuted at the 1906 Milan Fair. That is when espresso went worldwide and became beloved. Still improvements to come, though. Now, 2 years after that Milan Fair, in 1908, the first coffee maker using blotting paper-based filters was invented. This is what we were talking about earlier. German entrepreneur Melita Benst came up with the idea to use paper filters due to the tendency for percolators to overbrew the coffee, making the drink extremely bitter. The first drip coffee maker was also introduced in 1908, the very first one. This was truly the first signs of the downfall of the coffee pot and percolator empire. In just a few short decades, they would become completely obsolete, ancient objects. Even today, however, antique coffee pots remain collectible and desirable items, particularly those crafted in the sterling silver. As we mentioned before, some going at auction for absurd prices. In 1929, the French press was invented by another Milanese designer, Calamani. I did not know the French press was that young. Less than 100 years old. That is fascinating. In 1954, welcome to the electric age, the first electric drip coffee maker, called the Wigomat, maybe Vigomat, was invented in Germany by Gottlob Wiedmann. We are so close to the present time with our coffee-making technology in this story, and so many Germans contributing, especially in the 1900s, to basically take technology and use it to bring coffee into our homes conveniently and easily and deliciously. Baristas everywhere can thank Fema, the company. In 1961, they produced the first pump-driven espresso machine, which used a motor-driven pump instead of physical force to produce the pressure. And this is the design that became the standard all over the world. And then finally, in 1972, it finally happened. The electric drip coffee maker was popularized all across America by the brand Mr. Coffee, completely replacing the percolator as the most popular brewing method both for home and commercial use in the United States. And that virtually destroyed all other methods in the U.S. Don't get me wrong. there are still lots of people brewing in other ways, in their own ways, many of which we just mentioned. In fact, there are probably more people returning to other older methods of brewing now more than ever before. Plus, newer inventions like the Keurig, or rather single-serve K-cup style coffee makers, which I personally just love. This is really the technology that's given drip makers a run for their money since 1972 because they do make a single fresh hot cup of coffee, saving coffee. If we can figure out the waste, I think that they really will be a big home technology. But regardless of K-cups and all the other alternative methods, if you look at society as a whole, specifically North American society, the coffee drip maker is king. The electric drip maker is the king of the coffee jungle today, and every gas station, every fast food chain, every bank that you walk into, they've more or less got the exact same 1972 edition Mr. Coffee going, hot, ready, and waiting for you to pour yourself a cup. Just make sure to use a non-bleached filter, folks, will you please? For me. Thank you. I hope you enjoyed this exploration today. Truly a unique one. I had a lot of fun putting this episode together. Really hope you enjoyed it. We've got more coffee content coming at you shortly. No matter what brewing method you use, have you checked out the description? We've got a code for puritycoffee.com. Use code CHSPodcast for 20% off and free shipping one time. So upgrade your coffee no matter what you're doing, even if you're doing the ancient called the Ethiopian boiling pan. Upgrade those beans to purity. Use code CHSPodcast. Like I said, make sure you're subscribed. Make sure to share the show. I appreciate it, folks, so much. We've got some good stuff coming at you. Dr. Coffee coming back. Brand new guests. Some interesting topics. Stay tuned, everybody. This is Jordan River signing off saying have an extraordinary day. We'll see you next time on the Coffee, Health, and Science Podcast. Bye-bye.